Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, which is on the Eurozone crisis, fiscal profligacy or capital flows as final causes. The first thing I'm going to do is to tell the technicians the order in which we're going so that they have the slides. We're taking it in the order on the programme, okay, with Mr. Domenico Lombardi first. The issue that we're discussing this morning is the root causes of the Eurozone crisis. Obviously, once the crisis had occurred, there has been a lot of focus on the fiscal positions of some countries and the issues of debt sustainability and the debates backwards and forwards about fiscal austerity, fiscal consolidation, whether that impacts on demand in a favourable way or whether it impacts in a confidence on an alternative favourable way. We have those debates which focus on the fiscal position of different countries. But there is a school of thought that says that in the origins of the crisis, we shouldn't focus on the fiscal positions of countries because some of the countries which ended up in significant crisis and taking significant amounts of fiscal austerity medicine actually before the crisis had very low levels of public debt. That was true of Ireland and Spain. It was not true of Italy and Greece. And maybe what we're going to find in this debate is that, like many things in economics, there's an element of truth on both sides and that there are different causes of this crisis. But the alternative point of view of the causes of the crisis is that it wasn't primarily to do with fiscal profligacy in the first place, but was to do with the fact that the creation of the Eurozone with a space in which there was no foreign exchange risk, unleashed a set of capital flows. Indeed, I would point out that that was a deliberate intent of the Eurozone creation. If you go back to a Commission document written in 1991 about the values which would come from European monetary union, it was a document entitled One Market, One Money, and in it you will find an explicit argument that one of the benefits of a large Eurozone is that we will get more capital flows, and that the capital will flow from the areas of high productivity to the areas of low productivity, and that they will speed the process of convergence around Europe because capital will be able, once free of foreign exchange limitations, to pursue the greatest opportunities, which it was perceived must lie in the areas which were presently furthest behind in productivity. But there's a school of thought that says, but we got lots of capital flows. We know that we got lots of capital flows because there were large current account deficits. So the flip side is capital flows. But that those capital flows turned out to be not helpful capital flows, but harmful capital flows, which created instability. Capital flows which in some cases, to Greece and Italy, had a large public element to them. In others, were almost entirely private capital flows. So these are the different interpretations and issues of the causes of the Eurozone crisis, which we're going to discuss. They don't necessarily map easily into what are the solutions, because sometimes whatever the cause, you then have to deal with the situation which has subsequently arisen. But we have a very fine panel of people to address these issues, and we're going to go in the following order from right to left. Very briefly, Domenico Lombardi is director of CG's Global Economy Programme. CG is a partner of INET in many of our activities, and before he did that role, he was senior fellow at Brookings Institute, focusing on issues to do with the Eurozone. Professor Hans-Werner Sinn is professor at the University of Munich and president of the IFO Institute. And he should also, I should mention, is an author of a book called The Euro Trap, which I have to say is well worth reading with a particular point of view on these issues. Servas Strom is a senior lecturer at Delft University of Technology and also an author of a book on macroeconomics beyond the Nauru. and Andrea Terzi is Professor of Economics at Franklin University, Switzerland, and also attachment at the Levy Institute of Bard College, and was a co-editor about 8 years ago now, I think, of a book called The Euroland and the World Economy. So they're each going to talk for 15 minutes. I'm going to try to enforce control and discipline to 15 minutes because we believe in rules in Europe. And then I hope we'll have time for a good discussion. Domenico, can you start?
Thanks, Adair. Thanks very much for this invitation. What I'm going to present on this morning draws from some joint work that we have been doing at CG, jointly with my CG colleague, Samantha Sentamand. As you can see from the title of the first slide, we have decided to focus on Italy for a few reasons. First, because Italy was the economy, one of the economies that was worst hit by the global financial crisis in 2007, 2009. It lost about 6.6% of GDP then. Just to give you an idea, the Eurozone lost 4.4%, and the US, which was the center from which the crisis propagated, its GDP went down by 3%. So these are some order of magnitude. But that was not the end, of course. In the ensuing Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, Italy's economy has contracted the second most among Eurozone member countries, next to Greece. And in fact, its GDP is still expected to remain smaller than its pre-crisis level by the year 2019. And I would say the third reason why we have decided to focus on Italy is its public debt. First of all, in proportion to GDP, it's again the second highest in the Eurozone after Greece, standing at over 135% of GDP. But also, but in absolute terms, given the sheer size of the Italian economy, is essentially the highest in the Eurozone, even higher than Germany's or France's, despite those are, larger economies than Italy's. So with this as a way of background, actually, can I get a pointer, please?
Okay. The pointer.
So.
Right. Could somebody bring the pointer? Maybe you can put the first slide up. Yeah, they'll set the first slide. Where is the pointer?
And so essentially, these slides a little bit capture what I've been saying so far. As you can see, the gap between Italy's GDP dynamics and the Eurozone as a whole has been widening in the outer years of the chart. And clearly, this gap is likely to persist in the coming years. So, with this as a background, we asked the key question: what caused Italy's economy to fall so far, and also why its debt grew so large, especially during the crisis? One thing I want to thank you. Clearly, as it is, as it is evident from the title of this session, and as Adair pointed out at the outset, two sort of main explanations have been put forward to explain the euro area crisis. One is clearly an emphasis on the fiscal position. So whether there is, excessive fiscal expenditures or a fiscal position that is unsustainable. And then the other argument, and I'm a little bit, I'm summarizing here, has to do with, current account imbalances and excessive borrowing following the introduction of the single currency. And so just we have decomposed the debt to GDP ratio for Italy for the latest 20 years plus. Just want to draw your attentions on two facts. First, the green bar, the green portion, which essentially gives you the size of the primary balances. As you can see, Italy has always run positive primary balances, and with a couple of exceptions, with the exception of a couple of years. And then the second fact I'd like to draw your attention on is that the real, the GDP growth component has actually contributed to increase the debt to GDP ratio in the later years, essentially following the collapse in GDP growth. And this is why, as I said, the GDP component is exerting a positive, unfortunately, a positive contribution to the debt to GDP ratio. So with that in mind, you know, if we carried some simple simulations, again, to further reiterate the point. The solid line is the actual debt to GDP trajectory, and then the large dotted line is the simulated debt to GDP ratio, the simulated path of the debt to GDP ratio. What you can see is if Italy had grown at a rate equivalent to that of the Eurozone, you see that essentially the debt to GDP ratio would have been now much lower. On the other hand, if Italy had run primary balances at the same level as the Eurozone, its debt to GDP ratio would be approaching 200% and more. And as you can see, the gap between the two simulated paths widens, especially in the later years. Clearly, one could raise the point, well, but in a way that could feed back into lack of growth. But as I will argue in my later part of the presentation, we will argue that really lack of growth in Italy has to do mainly with reasons other than its fiscal position. And again, if we look at, just to corroborate this point, if we look at expenditures on a per capita basis, we see that on a per capita basis, Italy's expenditures are generally lower than the Eurozone. So Italy is the red bar, the Eurozone as a whole is the black bar. And not only that, but Italy's expenditures, again, on a per capita basis, are also significantly lower than both Germany's and France's by a significant amount. So when we talk about capital flows and the role of capital flows in triggering or amplifying the effects of the Eurozone crisis, you know, we look at the data, we see that generally Italy ran a small net financial balance prior to the crisis, and even throughout the crisis, if we look at some of you know, some indicative ratios like household loan to gross disposable income, they are still among the smallest in the Eurozone, despite households have been dipping into their pockets significantly, especially given a lack of GDP growth or outright contraction, as we saw earlier. So again, another way to look at the role of capital flows in the context of the Eurozone crisis is to see whether there were significant contagion and spillover effects. Again, we clearly, one could argue that there was a role for those effects, but the latest econometrics evidence points instead to a stronger role for weak fundamentals and a general increase in risk aversion that drove sovereign yields upwards. So instead, what the data that we looked at, tell us is that first of all, this the problems with the Italian economies are really deep-seated, deep-rooted. There is low productivity, high wage growth that has been going on for years, low levels of education attainment, and generally an unfriendly business environment, as we will see more in detail. For instance, if we look at the dynamics of ULCs and compare that with other Eurozone economies, not just those under stress, but also the dynamics of ULCs in France and Germany, we see two things. First of all, in the period pre-crisis, Germany is a sort of outlier from the other group. Essentially, Italy tends to move together with other countries, not just the ones under stress, but also France. And then following the crisis, there is some countries tend to converge more towards Germany, some others less. But what stands very clearly is that Italy, is the country that is diverging the most. And this is even more true if we look at an extrapolation based on current trends and current projections for productivity growth. Italy stands out as an outlier. And to converge to the levels set by Germany to the German ULC, we estimated, again, based on an extrapolation and on available projections, that Italy should cut real labor compensation by a greater amount than any other Eurozone economies we have looked at. Clearly, again, on this line, we saw that Italy has one of the lowest R&D expenditures in the whole Eurozone. It's essentially, second only to Greece. Also, Italy has one of the lowest numbers of workers in R&D as a percentage of total employment, and clearly this hampers its ability to support innovation and long-term growth. Again, to add further evidence to this point, if we look at the levels of tertiary education, Italy has the lowest level of tertiary education. And we look at two cohorts, a younger cohort of workers and an older cohort. Furthermore, Italy has also the lowest enrollment rates in the sciences, especially if this is compared with Germany. If we look at the ease of doing business in Italy, there is a survey that the World Bank carries out every year. There are, of course, some methodological question marks, as it always happens with this kind of surveys, but its results are broadly consistent with other surveys done worldwide. What emerges from this annual assessment is that, again, Italy boasts one of the most unfriendly business environments in the Eurozone. It's only second to Greece. In the ranking that the World Bank carries out, Italy stands as the 56th country out of 189. Again, just to give you an idea, Germany is 14th. And the way the World Bank carries out this survey is essentially by making an assessment of a number of parameters, of a number of benchmarks. And you can see Italy is the red dot, and the average is the black dot. As you can see, Italy tends to be almost always below the average. And for a couple of benchmarks, such as enforcing contracts and paying taxes, the gap becomes pretty significant. One has to say that based on those rankings, the economy has been improving over time. However, it still lags significantly behind, and again, it is clustered, together with Greece. Other Eurozone countries, on top of Germany, tend to perform significantly better in this exercise. So I think I have exhausted my time, Chair. I have also ended my presentation. So the points, really the takeaway points I want to leave you with is that clearly, the emphasis on the fiscal side, I hope we have shown that fiscal is important, but has not been really the key driver. Capital flows, again, this may have been a concurrent element, but again, has not really been the key driver. Really, the attention should be more on long-term, deep-seated structural issues, and it is important to get the diagnosis right, because, of course, the remedies that you want to set, you want to come up with, must be appropriate given the nature of the problems that the economy faces. Thank you, Chair.
Domenico, thank you very much, and thank you for sticking to time. Very interesting perspective, that, which suggests that alongside fiscal profligacy and capital flows, we have to consider the separate structural issues. Of course, even if that is the case, there could then be a debate about whether it will be easier to achieve structural reform with or without fiscal consolidation. It doesn't remove the debate, but it certainly is, a hugely important and I think quite convincing explanation of the root causes in Italy. Can I turn to Hans-Werner Sinn? Hans-Werner.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being invited here. Is this? It works. To speak on at a conference on new economic thinking. I'm not so sure whether my thinking is so new. At least the theories are not new. The problems are new. New economic problems with old economic thinking. This is what I want to do. Let me start by commenting on Domenico. I think everything you said is right. Italy did have zero primary balance, but that was not enough. It could have done much better. In the 5 years before the Madrid summit of 1995, when the ultimate timing of the euro was agreed, Italy's government had to pay 5 percentage points more interest on 10-year government debt than Germany, for example. And then, as you all know, with the announcement of the euro and the approximation to this date of currency conversion and fixation of the exchange rates in May 1998, the interest rates came all down. Had the Italian government saved this interest advantage in nominal terms, its entire debt-GDP ratio would be 0 by now. Had it saved at least the real advantage, if you compensate for inflation, its debt-GDP ratio nowadays would be 60%. But they didn't do that. This interest advantage was consumed by the government rather than being used to increase the primary balance. You know, it's all a matter of comparison. Yes, in comparison to other countries, you didn't do worse, but Italy didn't grow. And it had the unique chance when the euro was introduced to reduce its debt-GDP ratio by just saving the interest advantage which the euro brought. Actually, this advantage was as big as the entire value-added tax revenue of the country. It was huge, and you used it for breakfast. Italy is a difficult case because Italy did not go through an inflation, through a credit bubble like the others, but Italy did have inflation. From 1995, including the initial currency exchange rate adjustment that took place in 1995 until today, the GDP deflator in Italy increased by 25% relative to the rest of the Eurozone. So it is as if Italy still had the lira and had revalued the lira by 25%. This is a fact, and I think that is the reason why the competitiveness of the Italian economy has declined. Let me speak about the other countries. When this interest convergence took place, it was very tempting to borrow more. The Greek government could not withstand the temptation and borrowed to hire more people and increase the wages in the government sector. These wage increases went faster than the productivity increases in the economy, leading to price increases also in Italy, in Greece. So, and these enormous price increases, the relative inflation, deprived the country of its competitiveness. In Spain, the story was different insofar as it was not the government that borrowed, but private people, homeowners. People borrowed money from their banks, the banks borrowed abroad, and then they invested in real estate. There was a construction boom which was driving in 6 million people from abroad to help build these new homes. And there was a huge demand for workers in the construction industry, which allowed the unions to increase the wages. And these wage increases in the construction industry then enforced a wage increase on the entire economy, which again meant that Spain revalued in real terms also by about a quarter, the same number as in Italy. And basically it's the same story. It does not matter how foreign credit enters the economy through the government sector or through the real estate sector. In either case, Greece or Spain, it was ultimately cheap foreign credit which allowed wage increases beyond productivity, which led to a relative price increase, which deprived these economies of their competitiveness. This was not a problem as long as private investors were willing to finance the current account deficits that emerged. But, you know, when the crisis broke out in 2007, 2008, all of a sudden investors shied away. They did not continue financing, and they even wanted their money back. In that situation, the solution was printing the money which you could not borrow. So for the first few years of the crisis, basically refinancing credit from the local printing presses was given to the banks, and that replaced the private credit that before had come, showing up in terms of the target balances. That process was made possible by the ECB's policy of reducing the collateral requirements for such refinancing credit from the A level to the level of no investment grade, basically. When the rating agencies declared the government bonds of Greece, Portugal, and Ireland no investment grade, then the ECB Council said, we don't care. We still accept it as collateral, and thereby they made it possible for the banks to take larger and larger fractions of their assets to hand them in as collateral to their local central banks to receive the credit from the local central banks, which the private market would no longer be willing to provide. The ECB became increasingly nervous about this process, and pushed the politicians then to take over. And that happened 5 years ago in spring 2010, and you know that was the beginning of the fiscal rescue operations, one program after the other. So in a sense, I would say what happened is first, too much private capital was going to Southern Europe, too much because to some extent we wanted it. Adair said that. This was a deliberate policy. We wanted the capital to go to the low-wage countries where the marginal productivity of capital would be higher than elsewhere. But it was an overshooting process. The market did not find the right path to long-run equilibrium because we have false expectations. We all know that. There are sunspot equilibria and so on. So that was the first wave. Too much private capital was flowing. Then the ECB bailed out the over-indebted countries and their creditors. And then the fiscal rescue operations bailed out the ECB. So that is basically the process that has happened. Now, interesting to see what that implied for a country like Germany. Germany was always on the other side of the spectrum because, you know, countries depend on one another through goods trade and capital flows. The goods trade makes a positive correlation in the economic development. If one country goes up, it buys the other's goods, and so they go up and down in a symmetric way. But capital flows are entirely different. If capital goes from A to B, then B goes into the boom and A goes into the slump. The boom region was Southern Europe. Because they were booming, the imports were increasing, they developed current account deficits. And the slump region was Germany at the time. 10 years ago, Germany had 12% rate of unemployment, more than France today. And if you are in a slump, your income doesn't grow, your imports don't grow, and you develop a current account surplus, which is necessary for the real capital flow to take place. And now, during the crisis, everything is in reverse. Investors, savers, institutions from Germany who were the biggest capital exporters, have been all the time in the world, actually, no longer are willing that easily to go to Southern Europe, but they rather look for safe haven investment inside Germany. And so during the crisis, Germany received or developed a real estate boom of the sort which the other countries had before. So it's like it's a negative correlation. If one country goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa, when you talk about capital flows. Trade flows, it goes the same direction. Capital flows, always the other direction. Now, what can we do? Does this policy of pouring money at countries that have become too expensive really help? It helps to postpone the reforms. Yes, as long as the money flows, you don't have to go through a policy of tightening your belt. This policy comes only when the money is no longer there. Then you go through a policy of real devaluation. Ireland did it. Ireland's bubble burst already in 2006, 2007. That was 2 years before Lehman. And since there was no one to help Ireland at the time, they had to help themselves, cut their wages and prices. Actually, the GDP deflator relative to the rest of the Eurozone declined by 13% in Ireland. And they solved their problem. The Irish economy is booming. Last year, we had an increase in manufacturing output by 20% in Ireland. And the other countries who simultaneously, after Lehman came into the crisis, resorted to the printing press instead of tightening their belts. And that meant we have an ongoing problem maintaining this insufficient competitiveness, maintaining the wrong relative prices. Wrong relative prices is the issue to explain and understand the European crisis. It's not a Keynesian demand crisis, where we have a general lack of demand for an otherwise competitive economy. We have a lack of demand because you're too expensive, period. And of course, we can compensate for it with new borrowing for the time being. But is that a permanent and lasting solution? I doubt that. So we have to go through a policy of realignment of relative prices, and I think QE is the last chance we have to achieve this, because QE will lead to a devaluation, has led to a devaluation of the euro already, and hopefully this will only inflate Germany. If the other countries stay put and don't move while Germany's prices go up, then that is the chance for a realignment in the Eurozone to regain the competitiveness. But my guess is that will not happen, because everyone will take the opportunity to borrow more at low interest rates, and so we will just get a little bit more of more inflation in general, rather than this necessary realignment. So I'm very frustrated with seeing the European development, and my frustration leads me to the conclusion that we have to think about more radical things rather than staggering on, kicking the can down the road. And I have suggested in my book, which you cited, a debt conference to give debt relief to over-indebted states, banks, and central banks, the target debt, which they cannot repay, and to realign or readjust the Eurozone by making sure that those countries that do get debt relief are competitive. In the case of Ireland, I'm sure they are already competitive. So there's nothing we have to do. In the case of Greece, I'm sure they will never make it in the Eurozone. And it would be best for them to temporarily exit the Eurozone and return at a later point in time with public money from the other countries helping them to pay for sensitive imports like medicine and so on in the transition period. For other countries, I don't know. I don't know what is the right solution for Spain, for Portugal, for Italy. For Italy, actually, I'm despite all these problems, rather optimistic, because I do know that in northern Italy, we have one of the most productive parts of the European economy. So I don't think the necessary realignment in Italy is that large as it is in other parts of the Eurozone. But every government has to make the decision by itself, and it's very difficult for an economist to say what should happen. Thank you very much.
Hans Werner, thank you very much. I think a very interesting and I think a persuasive argument about the way that capital flows can then generate changes in wage rates which produce a disequilibrium in relative competitiveness, which then creates a problem. So it's a variant of the capital flow argument. I think much that people can agree with. I suspect there will be a debate about your assertion that there is no lack of demand, aggregate demand in the whole of Europe, and we might come back to that. But some radical proposals at the end about what we do about this accumulation of debt wherever it came from. Serve us.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, in my view, INET is a platform for engendering economic debate. And actually, I think this is what is going to happen right now. Let me make my position clear right at the start. I think the Eurozone crisis is a huge tragedy, and in a sense, it's also a disgrace to the economics profession. Economists often hide behind their models and their jargon, and they talk about things like internal devaluation, expansionary austerity, structural reforms is also a nice term, and these are all euphemisms of very painful policy adjustments, the cost of which must be counted in terms of generations of people, in terms of higher poverty, higher unemployment, higher inequality, I agree, it's a humanitarian crisis. You have to count the cost in terms of higher rates of morbidity and mortality. And there is a huge political fallout as well. Now, economics and economists can always hide behind the following argument saying that, well, it's all due to the politicians. We economists know what should happen, but it is these politicians which are not up to their task. And I think that is too easy. It's the soft option. The point is that economists are actually advising these politicians, and the title of the paper is Myths, Mix-ups, and Mishandlings. I think there is all kinds of wrong policy advice. And I would like to carry you through the paper, which is actually rather long and much too long for 15 minutes. So I'll try to be very, very quick, but I would also very much hope that people will have a look at the paper. Well, the first myth or misunderstanding is that is the view that fiscal indiscipline, especially in the periphery, is the let's say the final cause of the ultimate cause of the crisis. Fiscal indiscipline is supposed to lead to unsustainable public deficits and debts in the periphery. The main point of which was that the periphery was left without enough fiscal policy space to counter the external shock of the great financial crash in Wall Street. There is this saying by Benjamin Franklin: the failure to prepare is really the preparation for failure. And in a way, that is the point made here. I mean, the countries in crisis now should have been prepared. My argument is that by how much? I mean, how can you prepare for what happened? The crisis, in this view, is a sovereign debt crisis, and hence fiscal consolidation is the solution. And then the argument is that fiscal austerity obviously is going to be very painful in the beginning, but after the much-needed adjustment, there will be recovery once private sector confidence has been restored by public sector thrift. This is the main line of the ECB, the European Commission, as far as I can understand it. The problem, I think, is that it's not really true if you look at the data in various ways. First of all, in the paper we look at changes in sovereign debt in the Euro period, pre-crisis. And for the Eurozone as a whole, public debt declined as a percentage of GDP. Spain is obviously exceptional by 24 percentage points decline. There's also no indication that financial markets were worried about what happened to public debts. The public debts were not really considered to be excessive. There was lowering of the interest rate spreads and so on. And I think if you sort of look back at what happened and talk about public debt being a huge problem, it is what I think in Germany would be called Hineininterpretierung, and what perhaps a Chicago trained economist would call perfect hindsight. Yeah. Now, what happened to sovereign debts? Very clear. There was a huge increase after the crisis, after the nationalization of debts. So that is sort of the time sequence. I think it's also very important to compare the changes, and I mean, okay, we can say public debt in Greece increased, yes, but actually public debt in Germany increased as percentage of GDP even a little bit more. That is not a very useful discussion. I think you should put these public debt changes into the context of what happened with private debts. And actually the private debt changes trivialized, dwarfed whatever happened to public sector debts. I mean, the numbers are there in the paper. It's like for the Eurozone as a whole, there was an increase, this is the change, of private sector debt up to 165% of Eurozone GDP. So there is a huge private sector debt buildup. Spain, mentioned already before, is a clear case in point. So there is this private sector debt buildup, and then the question is, and the numbers are 100% plus, how can the public sector, using Benjamin Franklin's term, prepare, be sort of ready to cope with the fallout of the ultimate implosion of this private sector bubble? Now, so that is the first point. The second point is what were the impacts of these debts? Well, if you look at the cross-country Eurozone with used country data, and if you look at cross-country patterns, we find there is no significant correlation between change in public debt and, let's say, economic growth, house prices, etc. So it's like the member state variation is not explained by interstate variations in public debt. This is not true for household sector debt. Household sector debt actually is a statistically very significant determinant of home prices, home price increases, basically meaning more household debt, higher house prices, higher household consumption, higher growth, and so on. So it's sort of the push through household sector indebtedness, and Spain again is a very clear point, which is driving up the asset bubble and which is promoting or stimulating growth. In many countries, higher household debts explain about half of pre-crisis economic growth, and we therefore think that the emphasis, or let's say single-minded emphasis on public debts is rather misplaced. And in a way, this is being recognized in recent research by, for instance, IMF economists Bornhorst and Ruiz-Arranz, who have done statistical analysis showing that it's actually private debt buildup which is harmful to growth. Well, I won't go into the details, but so there is a line of research there. Now, austerity is the solution. That is what is being said. I will not go into a detailed analysis. I think it's clear that it is not working. There's a recent report by German Institute IMK, which is basically arguing or showing that the Greek recession is almost completely explained by Greek fiscal austerity. And the IMF, in a way, has come round to the view that fiscal austerity is the wrong medicine in the present conditions. And even staunch proponents of expansionary fiscal consolidation have substantially toned down their claims in practice. And Greek Finance Minister Varoufakis basically said that we should not talk about expansionary fiscal consolidation. We should actually talk about contractionary fiscal non-consolidation, because there is also no consolidation of the debt. Yes, I'm sorry, I did not pay attention to the... This is the graph showing change in household debt and home prices. This is about austerity. The second misunderstanding, myth, is the view that the crisis is a crisis of labor, what we call labor cost competitiveness. I mean, the central variable is unit labor cost, and we heard the argument. The idea is that, let's say, real revaluations and devaluations are the prime cause of the imbalances and also of the subsequent capital flows. Actually, in our view, the causality is actually exactly the opposite. The reverse causality, it's capital flows driving the imbalances. So it's not related to these unit labor cost changes. Rising unit labor cost means wages are outgrowing productivity, and this is argued to be the Southern Europe's main problem. It's due to rigid, inflexible labor markets with strong unions and strong employment protection. That is the idea. High unit labor costs have led in this view to declining export growth, rising current account deficits, and growing foreign debts. The only way to get out of this crisis is to restore cost competitiveness by cutting wages by 30% or more and a drastic liberalization of the labor market. This is the official view of codified in the Europlus Pact, and it's also the official view of what is known or what is called the Informal European Council. Well, the problem is that if you look at the data, again, in a statistical sense, it is not clear that there is a relation. I mean, you can make graphs, but if you look at the statistics, there is no clear statistical association, significant association within Europe, between increases in relative unit labor cost and export performance, import performance, and current account imbalances. Whatever association exists is too small to explain the real growth in the current account imbalances. And that may come as a surprise to many, but I want to give you two reasons why wages, that is the proposition, don't matter too much for cost competitiveness. I'll try to be even quicker. Well, first of all, there's econometric evidence. As I said, the two reasons are, first of all, unit labor costs are just a proportion of the total price. The other point is that increases in unit labor costs are not always automatically totally transmitted onto higher prices. In practice, what happens is an increase in wages, let's say of 10%, which would be a lot, is translating into, let's say, an increase in export prices or import cost of 2%. So it's like the relationship is not 1-to-1, it's like 1-to-5. There's an even more important reason, I think, conceptually, and that is for the OECD countries, competition Competition is important, but it's not about prices and cost. Competition is about innovation, non-price factors, technology. Schumpeter stated this already in 1943, I want to quote, "In capitalist reality, as distinguished from the textbook picture, it's not price competition which counts, but the competition from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization. It's competition which strikes at the foundations of firms and at their very lives." And I think that is actually what is driving the competitive process in Europe. And when we talk about competition, I'm not saying competition or competitiveness is unimportant. I'm saying cost competitiveness is getting too much attention. And what is the real problem of the Eurozone is the divergence in terms of economic structures, production structures, export specialization patterns, in terms of technology intensity. So it's the non-price technology competitiveness which is actually the key issue. Now, this is a big problem because at the Eurozone level, the informal European Council is still thinking in terms of unit labor cost, and they have, like there is Mr. Juncker, Tusk, Dijsselbloem, and Draghi, in a very recent report presented a graph which shows percentage change in unit labor cost on the one hand, and the percentage change in the unemployment rate. And basically, their regression line is the upward-sloping one, saying that countries where unit labor cost increased much in the pre-crisis period, this is important, those countries suffered high increases in unemployment in the post-crisis or in the crisis period. Now, there is a problem with the graph because if you do the statistics, you will find, this is what we found, that the upward-sloping regression line actually depends totally on the observation for Greece. If we exclude Greece from the observation, basically there's no statistical observation and the line is just the horizontal line, so there is no link. There's another problem, this is the second graph, that is why compare pre-crisis changes in unit labor cost to post-crisis changes in unemployment? Why not look at post-crisis changes in unit labor cost and post-crisis changes in unemployment? And what we get is a very statistically significant negative relationship, basically meaning that wherever internal devaluations have been strongest, unemployment has been rising fastest. And this does not depend on Greece. Yeah, let me put it, doesn't depend on any other country. Okay, now, so the point of view is the internal devaluations are not working. There's a much more fundamental point. Internal devaluations are not going to improve the non-price technological competitiveness of countries. Labor market deregulation is not going to improve non-price competitiveness of Southern Europe. Actually, there have been various presenters in the conference. There's Mario Pianta, there's Bill Zonik, there's Alberto Botta, there's Professor Simonazzi, and there is Professor Richard Hyman. Various people who look at innovation, industrial relations, business organizations, and the big point is it's not like flexible low wage labor is going to promote technological upgrading and so on. It basically means building up non-price technological capabilities needs mission-oriented public investment. It needs particular forms of business organizations. It means commitment between workers and firms, and it means committed finance. I'm committed finance, not footloose finance. Okay, I'll try to be quick. There's Europeans love rules. The Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands, the Dutch love rules, but they are also known for transgressing rules. We never stick to the rules. We have rules, but never stick. What is the final cause of the crisis? I'll be very short. It is basically a private sector debt build-up pushed from the core by stagnating economies, especially Germany, very low returns, by an exploding, expanding, self-centered banking sector. Banking glut is the term which is often used. So there's a push factor, there's a pull factor from the periphery, very cheap credit in the form of very low rates of real interest, and very high rates of return to investments in activities which are not helping to upgrade productive structures and which are not upgrading or expanding export capabilities. It's basically like the average property developer in Spain in the pre-crisis period could borrow money at a real interest rate of about 0.4% and get a rate of return of 34%. So it's push and pull, but it's huge. The the low rates of interest in the periphery were the outcome of the one-size-fits-all monetary policy of the ECB, which gave greater weight to slowly growing low inflation Germany, and then to the higher growth and higher inflation periphery. This is a fundamental weaving error, you could say, of EMU. But for the rest, I think capital flows, credit flows were perfectly rational markets in line with market logic. They were going south to where the returns were highest, basically locking Southern Europe into low-tech, non-tradable activities and exports. Now, what is needed, I'm there, what is needed to end the Eurozone crisis, I think, is first and foremost the plain recognition that the crisis is due to an unsustainable private leverage boom, which was aided and abetted by the liberalization of integrating European financial markets and, let's say, reckless banks. Once this is recognized, more sensible policy measures, which are there on the slide, follow naturally. The key issue is how Eurozone leaders can be made, and this is a nice phrase, to wake up from the deep slumber of a decided opinion. The words are John Stuart Mill's, and I hope that our paper serves that purpose. That's my conclusion.
Sylvester, thank you very much. A very clear and different point of view, though actually some overlaps in the causes, but a major difference in terms of what we do about it now that we are where we are. Andrea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this conversation today. And my answer to the question posed to this panel is in the title of my presentation. And I mean precisely what it says, that the final cause of the Eurozone crisis is that there is not enough debt or credit, as you may call it. So in my time today, I will explain why neither fiscal profligacy or capital flows provide a full account of the cause of the crisis, and I will offer a rather different interpretation that builds upon a critique of the notion of savings of well-established orthodox analysis. In our discipline, beliefs that are considered today well-established and orthodox are not always the best-known answers of the time. So this would be also an attempt to provoke new economic thinking, as the INET mission advocates, and to contribute to what George Soros calls the constructive phase of INET. So we should move from the classics, an activity that is less pursued today with the downgrading of the history of the economic thought course to an optional course in university economics curricula. So today I'm seeking guidance from Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes. From Smith, I'm taking the notion that prosperity of a nation depends ultimately not on its financial wealth, but on its capacity to provide necessities and conveniences of life to its people. So I'm taking from Smith the ultimate objective of public policy being that of promoting the full use of labor resources towards real wealth. And from Keynes, I'm taking the notion that real outcomes are shaped by monetary decisions because people care about financial stocks and monetary flows. And so I let Smith set in the goal, the real welfare of the nation, prosperity, output, and labor, and Keynes setting the instrument, removing the monetary and financial impediments to real prosperity. Contemporary macroeconomics seems to be skewed towards a vision where people only care of real interest rates, real returns. People who care of nominal values are considered irrational. And considering Smith's recognition of money as a wheel of commerce, these models seem to me to be plus royaliste que le roi, more Smithian than Adam Smith himself. But let's move on to Europe. Why we continue to worry of the Eurozone crisis? Most people connect this to the government debt crisis that occurred in the aftermath of the Lehman collapse and peaked in 2012 with Draghi's OMT and is now fading away. We see the full cycle of the crisis. Behind this, there was both high accumulated debt and capital flights. But this shows what many people seem to fully recognize today, that by entering the Eurozone, countries had permanently lost access to central bank money, and this created the conditions for credit concerns and liquidity runs within the monetary union itself. In an article that was published a couple of months after OMT in the ECB working paper, Binzeil and Winkler parallel the crisis in the Eurozone to the German banking crisis of the 1930s, and they say that the final cause of that crisis, which brought to ruin the German state and civil society, was one, draconian austerity, and two, the Reichsbank being forbidden from buying government bonds. It was published a couple of months after OMT. But let me also put in a hopefully effective way that a country that loses access to central bank money and becomes credit constrained can only support internal demand through bank lending and private debt. At the same time, a country losing access to central bank money can only avoid running out of euros by generating a surplus in the current account. Kind of conflicting strategies. So what happened is simple. Some countries went in one direction, and some other countries went in the other direction. Those who expanded debt fared relatively better before the crisis, at which point it was the others that fared better. But the big picture of divergence, imbalance issue in the Eurozone is rooted here. Countries' divergence brings, of course, to the governance crisis. There is an ongoing discussion and transition from rules-based governance to institution-based governance. Draghi has talked about constrained discretion as the next step, which I think is a good idea, but the big question is to do what? Because more fundamentally, we all continue to worry about a euro crisis because of this. 14 largest economies, growth rates, the euro area is a drag on and a threat to the world economy. I don't think I need to convince you of this. And yes, there are regional differences within the union, as there are in any monetary union, within the UK, within the US, within Germany, there are differences. But stagnation exacerbates those differences within the union, and nothing is happening. Well, this is the double dip recession. If you want to compare the Eurozone with the US, this double dip recession of the Eurozone, and nothing is really happening. This is borrowed from a presentation of the OECD chief economist that eloquently describes the frustration of forecasters when it comes to Europe. So I think I don't need to spend much time on the fiscal profligacy because we seem to be in agreement that the large deficits were not a cause. But also we should remember what every economist knows, that the cyclical, the budget deficits is largely endogenous. This is the U.S., but this is Europe before the crisis. And what happened with austerity was the decoupling, pushing down the deficits, enforcing this reduction, which is not longer cyclical, and pushing unemployment up. So profligacy can be better seen as the public debt overhang that restricted the fiscal space of nations. But the next question is, what makes debt high? Markets have credit concerns, not numbers. And as the full cycle of the debt crisis that we've seen before shows. So the fact is that in Europe, debt is high when the rules of the European Union say so. More than profligacy, I see a lot of fiscal negligence of governments, things like poor quality control of government spending, lack of enforcement tax system, poor public infrastructure. This is fiscal negligence, which is very insidious because it doesn't necessarily show up in the deficits. And corruption and bad spending live well under balanced budget rules. So what does Europe need to do now? What final causes need to be removed to reclaim the economic strength of the continent and provide the necessary condition following Keynes for growth? Every professional forecaster knows that growth forecast depends on expectations of growth of demand in different sectors. The disagreement is about where demand should be coming from and what demand is sustainable, how demand should be financed. One reason why demand should not come from government deficits is it's been argued that this absorbs personal savings. So we need to move into the discussion of savings because this is really crucial. Textbooks make a lot of confusion on savings. In the neoclassical growth chapter, they say savings are good. In the business cycle Keynesian chapter, they say savings are bad. And as some economists warn us about savings glut and the next moment about a savings shortage. So I come to my final 3 points. What savings are not? Current orthodoxy defines savings as a source of finance for investment, for government debt, usable towards capital flows. In my humble opinion, this is the next concept that INET should help demolish. Personal savings are presented to us as the difference between after-tax income and consumption spending. They call it this personal savings. You can call it Zippo, but the fact is that this number in national accounts is the value added in the production of investment goods. So it's a real savings. And in fact, I think that the narrative of saving being a source of funds suits only a non-monetary economy where saving is a real resource. Because when people save as a real commodity like corn, the decision to save is fully personal matter. You may decide to consume it, store it, waste it as you please without directly affecting other people's consumption of corn. Only if you decide to lend it, you establish a relationship with others. So my second point is what savings are in a monetary economy. There's something very different. They are a relation so personal saving is not what you think, okay, and financial saving is an act that reflects on others. It's always asset and liability. Of every penny of behind every penny of savings, there is a penny of debt, and so savings do not fund anything. They seek funding. You need to fund your savings. This completely breaks the narrative of financial savings as a source of funds available for investment. And the question to be asked is not whether savings are good or bad, but can people fund the savings that they want to accumulate? Financial savings don't add to a positive number; they add to zero. In the whole world, if you add up the personal savings, you get a positive number because you're adding investment spending, investment production, really. And if you add up the financial savings, you get zero. This is the Eurozone only, but it's a full accounting system with the foreign sector built in. You get the colors in a moment. I just want to make the point that the credits and debits are, of course, add to zero. I have no time to go into the specifics of the different sectors here, but you see here again the cyclical correlation between the government deficit, which is the dark green, which is supporting the savings on the upper side. And the other thing that is supporting the savings is private debt, which is the light green. And you see the cycles up to 2010. And after 2010, you see the public debt forced down faster than the private sector was prepared to accept. So the double dip recession that we saw earlier can be described as a saving and debt shortage recession in the Eurozone. And if I can go back, yes, the yellow lines on the most recent period are the fortunate conditions that Professor Sin talked about that support the savings thanks to the current account surplus. How long this will last, we'll see. But so textbooks ask, are savings good or bad? But this is not the question to ask. The question really, as I said, is can people fund the savings that they really desire to accumulate? And we should move away from the conflict between neoclassical models pro savings and Keynesian models pro consumption. When people cannot fund their private savings, spenders are simply not happy and with their current savings, and the economy goes south. So this takes me to my last point. Physicists say that a theory of the universe is not credible if it cannot be condensed on a T-shirt. So this is my T-shirt model of job creation. And the first says that jobs increase when private agents think they have more savings than needed, which leads to spending. The second tells us that private agents know better than anybody else what their savings needs are. And the third is this accounting truth that gross private savings must equal the private debt, the government debt, and the foreigners' debt. So this describes the endogeneity of government deficits during a recession, where the only way to keep the gross savings constant with deleveraging is an expansion of government debt. And this is what happens when you put a cap on government debt and you have deleveraging and you're not lucky on the foreign front, and the gross savings are downsized in a debt shortage recession. What are the options for a situation where the debt available is not enough to fund the savings that people desire? If you put a cap on DG on government debt, you only have two options. Either you accept an increase in private debt, or you hope for an increase in foreigners' debt. The EU is telling the world, in other words, that they intend to support growth with private debt and the debt of the others, without taking responsibility for its own ambitious project, which is the Economic and Monetary Union. And this is not the way in which Europe may survive in the long run. Thank you very much.
Andrea, thank you very much. That was a very interesting focus on, some fundamental issues of theory. And I guess the final message at the end was that if we attempt simultaneous private deleveraging and public-led deleveraging, we are bound to have a shortage of demand, to which the answer is either, as you say, current account surpluses, or a re-expansion of private debt, or for governments themselves to run higher debt levels. I'm struck in the UK, I mentioned this yesterday, by if you look at the forecasts for the UK economy, which our Office of Budget Responsibilities says will develop quite well over the next 5 years, that growth, they say, will only occur if there is an expansion of private debt. Indeed, there is a graph which clearly shows that what has happened for the last 4 years is some deleveraging of the private sector offset by a more than offsetting increase in public debt. And then what they forecast for the next 5 years is the complete inversion of that the public debt will begin to come down because of our fiscal consolidation program, but that is only compatible with a rapid rate of growth if the private debt returns to a higher than the levels of leverage which existed in 2007. So UK official growth forecasts are based upon a re-expansion of private debt to levels in excess of that. I guess where I would question is that a stable long-term thing, or don't we have to find some way where we can grow our economies without a relentless increase in leverage, either public or private debt? Well, let's have a discussion now. One thing that struck me going through the various very insightful presentations is that there may actually be far more agreement on the causes of the crisis than what we now do. Because actually, as between Servas and Hans Werner, although I think a lot of people would be perceiving that they are saying different things in terms of the policy reaction, there was a relatively common story that there had been a lot of capital flows which were not going into new productive investment which improved the productive capacity of the lower income countries, but instead went into various bubbles. Both of them, I think, were saying that the fundamental reason for the divergence of unit labour costs was driven by the bubbles rather than the other way round. That was what I think Hans Werner said, and you said, Servas, that it's not that the unit labour costs went up and therefore there was a current account deficit. It's more that there were capital inflows, property and real estate bubbles, at least in Spain and Ireland, and then a unit labour cost problem. I think what also came out of the debate is a diversity between different countries. I think the story is different in Greece, where there is more of an argument that the problems start on the public sector and increases in public sector pay that then refer over to the traded sectors of the economy, whereas undoubtedly in Spain and Ireland it derived initially in the private sector and then extended to the public sector through the post-crisis response. What I think is interesting, though, is even if you agree how we got to this position, you can still disagree about what we do about it. Even if you think that most of the public debt derived initially on the private side and moved to the public side, you can still argue either for or against fiscal austerity, and there are different points of view there. And even if you agree that the fundamental driver was from capital flows to unit labour costs rather than unit labour costs to capital flows, you can still disagree as to whether a programme of reducing unit labour costs by internal devaluation is a good or a bad thing. And then, of course, Domenico reminded us that there are some very important structural issues there as well. So, who would like to come in and ask questions in relation to this? I'm going to take 4 in a row, I think. I'm going to start with David Vines.
Can I suggest that there might be more in common between Servas Storm and Hans-Werner Sinn than we thought on hearing what they presented? Of course, non-price competitiveness is important, but I think everyone should agree that cost competitiveness is also important. And given non-price competitiveness, which depends on a long history in each particular country in different ways, international adjustment does require adjustment of relative cost competitiveness. That's, if you like, speaking in support of Hans-Werner Sinn. But I'd also like to speak in support of John Maynard Keynes in response to what Hans-Werner Sinn said. He talked about the need to have more inflation in, if you like, the north of Europe than the south, and described with hope how QE will cause currency depreciation and bring this about. If this was an international conference, this would be described as beggar thy neighbour devaluation. And that's Europe's recipe, given where Europe is now. My response that John Maynard Keynes would say, more internal demand is needed in Europe, particularly in the north. Now, I ask you, how can I be in support of both John Maynard Keynes and of Hans-Werner Sinn in response to what Servas Storm said? Well, Trevor Swan gave us the answer. There are 2 things going on here, a need for internal balance as well as external balance. And to do that, you need 2 instruments. One instrument is relative cost adjustment, and that's Hans-Werner Sinn's story, but the other is the appropriate level of domestic absorption. And I really do want to ask the 2 speakers, couldn't Servas just agree that relative cost adjustment would help? And we could all line up with him in saying, and it's much better done in the north than forcing deflation on the south. But couldn't Hans-Werner Sinn agree with many others that what is needed is more demand in the north? And if German consumers won't do more demand, then what's needed is much more lax fiscal policy in the north. And then we would have Trevor Swan, and James Mead won the Nobel Prize for sorting out this and describing how an international system was meant to work. And I'd commend that reasoning to those who talk about Europe.
David, thank you. Very good challenge. So proposition is that we need both relative cost adjustments, but also a nominal demand stimulus across the Eurozone. There's a lady there. Who am I going to take next? Yep. Yeah, could we get a mic? Oh, could you step up to talk at one of these, please? Yeah. Yes, and can you just...
Yeah. Yes, Simonazzi from Italy. I think that there is an agreement between Professor Sinn and Professor Storm as well. When Professor Sinn argued in the last part of his speech that he is less pessimistic on Italy, in spite of Italy having the highest debt to GDP ratio and not pushing it down in all these 10, 15 years, in spite of not having had the same domestic deflation or devaluation than Ireland. And he argued that he is less pessimistic because of the northern industry, the northern Italian industry. So I think that this is the answer. I mean, the difficulties of the southern and the northern countries within the European Union was mostly because they were different in terms of industrial structure, in terms of power. And if you say that you are optimistic on the Italian industry, on the Italian economy because of its industry, in spite of not having had any domestic inflation, you are arguing that there are other forces that are important in terms of competitiveness. And if I can add, I don't think that, yeah, just one point. I don't think that Italian wages have gone up very much since 1992, 1993. Maybe there has been a problem of productivity, but I don't think there was a problem of wages.
So you think the unit labour costs primarily came through the productivity side?
And there are other different indicators of competitiveness. If you use export prices instead of unit labor costs, you find completely different indicators.
Now, I have a chorus of people wanting to... And first, yeah, there. And then I'm going to take...
Yes.
And then I'm going to take Peter Jordan. And then we're going to see where we've got to there.
Thank you. Anne Pesh for Prime Economics in London. I just want to address this to Hans-Werner Sinn, that he complains about the flood of money into Greece and the cheap and reckless borrowing, which indeed there was, at very low rates at that time. But wasn't that the purpose of the Eurozone? Wasn't that the purpose? And doesn't it remind us very much of Germany in 1924, when equally Germany opened up after the Dawes Plan to international capital markets and Wall Street flooded money into Germany. There was a boom, and then there was a bust, and then there was austerity. So we've seen this happen before in the Eurozone. And why haven't we learned the lessons of Germany in 1924?
Thank you. Pier Paolo Barbieri. I was just wanting to ask the panel, especially those that talk about austerity as this demon, why is it so hard to make the distinction between a spending cut and a structural reform when we have these debates? Because I believe that structural reforms are not things that have to be demonized across the board. So while we say we can all agree that if you cut wages in the public sector by 15%, aggregate demand will go down in an economy. At the same time, it's hard to defend certain of the things that have been changed in Europe over the last 5 years. So for instance, the automatic linkage between inflation and automatic rises in Spanish wages, everybody agreed was a negative thing. Or the fact that in Italy you have more parliamentarians than you have in the United States, a point that Domenico was partly talking about when he talked about the public sector. Or the fact that in Greece, still to this day, pharmacies cannot open on a Sunday. Those very basic things are very different than the things that we actually talk about when we talk about spending cuts. So I think it's important to make that distinction between what's actually a pro-growth structural reform that will create more demand in the medium run and something that it cannot be denied cuts aggregate demand in the short run. Thanks.
Significant structural reforms with fiscal stimulus. I mean, they are, as you suggest, sometimes conflated, but actually really separate issues for us to debate the pros and cons on.
Thanks.
I have two short questions to Professor Sinn. Did I get you correctly? You're saying, and it goes in the similar direction, that simply looking on increase of aggregate demand would not solve the problem in those Eurozone countries. And second, on your idea of the European Debt Conference, did I get it correct that you said that the debt relief would only be possible or thinkable, in your view, for those countries who are competitive and not for those who would not be competitive, and therefore it could be regulated or only instrumentalized only outside the Eurozone or temporarily outside the Eurozone?
Comments. And picking up from what Peter just asked, I'll do a little challenge to Hans-Werner. Your idea of a debt relief was very interesting, and you did imply that it would be somehow contingent on some measure of competitiveness. Now, if we took the measure of competitiveness and sustainability as being, are you now running a current account surplus and are you running a primary surplus on the budget, Greece, I think, now meets those two conditions. So are you suggesting there should be debt relief for Greece, just to give a little spice? But I'm actually going to take it in order to all of these questions. Domenico, can you respond? And I think, you know, David Vine's question was an interesting one. Well, maybe that's really for Hans Werner and Servas. You know, why can't we do both relative price adjustments within the Eurozone and stimulus? But there were various other points that you may want to respond to, or respond to that one as well. Domenico.
Thanks, Adair. Several questions, but let me react to some of them in order to the points raised by my colleague, Dr. Sin. Again, we have looked at sectoral financial flows. We have not seen that, again, that story has played a significant role in Italy vis-a-vis other economies of the Eurozone under stress. The literature available so far has also pointed that in those countries which have experienced significant financial flows, the size of the non-traded sectors has also increased. While if you look at Italy, the comparative size between the traded and non-traded sectors has been approximately the same. In terms of missed opportunities, I clearly one has to fully agree, but I also want to emphasize that clearly now we are where we are. If we look at latest data, if we look at, say, 2007, at the onset of the financial crisis, Italy's debt was 103% of GDP. And now, after some, significant fiscal adjustment, it is at 137 of GDP. And therefore, this brings me to the point that David Vines was making. And clearly, there has to be clearly a greater effort by the Eurozone economies in adjusting. And Italy clearly has a long way to go in that direction, as I showed in my presentation. But clearly, this has also to be facilitated at the regional level. And certainly, the latest moves by the ECB would provide, an important opportunity. So I think I would stop here, and if there are other questions, I'll come back. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Italy is a slightly different case than all the others, I repeat, and I'm more optimistic because Italy's net foreign debt position is just 30% of GDP, while all the other crisis countries are in the range of 100% of GDP. It's a completely different story. So I think Italy has the power to really do their homework internally. Is Greece competitive because they have a current account of zero now? No, you have to look at the full employment, so to say, adjusted current account. If you have a current account of zero just because of a mass unemployment of 25%, this is certainly not a sign of competitiveness. Peter Jungen, yes, my view would be that a debt relief is not enough, because then it's a bottomless pit. You give a country a debt relief, and then it goes on like that forever. You have to provide new credit to finance the country. Only competitiveness makes sure that they are self-sustained, that they have an orderly labor market functioning somehow, and don't need a foreign credit. I mean, I would like to cite Joe Stiglitz here, because many people like him, I too. What defines the competitiveness of a country? Every country in the world can be competitive. Even the most unproductive country you can imagine can be competitive if the wage level and the living standard, the aspiration level, is as low as this competitiveness. The problem arises only if you want to have a living standard beyond your productivity, because then you're too expensive, then you have problems with current account deficits and so on. That is the fundamental problem. And if you pump credit into an economy, as we did in the first 10 years before the crisis, then you increase the living standard and the wages and everything beyond something which is sustainable. It is not so easy to reallocate capital as our neoclassical model suggests to exploit the differences in marginal productivities, because the whole process leads to enormous political distortions in these economies. I must say I myself was far too optimistic initially when the euro came. I used this argument and thought, well, exactly, that's what we want, you know, but the sort of mess which has resulted, including the political turmoil resulting from unemployment, went far beyond my expectations. But we have it, and we have to face this problem. One general remark: there's often talk about austerity. Austerity we have, but the austerity comes exclusively from the markets. The markets are not willing to finance Greece, or if so, at astronomical interest rates. Political decisions in Europe have always mitigated austerity. I mean, the money which was allowed to print in the southern European countries in the replacement of private credit is a mitigation of austerity. The fiscal rescue programs are a mitigation of austerity. And I find the whole debate about austerity somewhat confused, because often it is said that those countries which provide public credit to other countries are imposing austerity to the other countries. The argument is really absurd, because they are mitigating austerity rather than imposing it. Of course, they don't provide as much credit as one would possibly like to have. That constraint is perceived then as austerity. But, you know, it doesn't help. Greece has received, by now, 324 billion euros in terms of public credit from other countries, with a GDP of 180. That's 180% of GDP, public credit from public institutions. 1/3 from the ECB, 2/3 from the rescue programs. 1/3 of this money was used to finance the Greek current account. 1/3 was financed to help investors from abroad to return safely home and bring their money into safe havens. And 1/3 was used by Greek people to escape. Rich Greek people borrowed on their wealth in Greece and shifted the money abroad. So what is the solution? What is the implication of this? Reduction of austerity, mitigation, enormous mitigation of austerity, which the world has never ever seen before, more than doubling of the rate of unemployment, from 11% 5 years ago to now 26%. So somehow we have to understand this doesn't work any longer. How long do we want to go on? You can argue, make the Keynesian argument, in a sudden crisis like 2008, 2009, I understand that fully, but you cannot do that year after year. We cannot solve this world and replace the capital market with financial capital flows. We undermine the whole functioning of a capitalist economy if it is public institutions that determine where scarce capital is being invested.
Hans-Werner, thank you very much, though I think you would agree that the private capital flows did a pretty bad job of, well, you said it, of allocating capital as well. I think what we know is that both private and public flows can be pretty bad at allocating capital. Service, how about David's, challenge? Why aren't you arguing both for a stimulus to demand and appropriate adjustments in unit labour costs relatively across the Eurozone?
Okay, yeah. Actually, I grew up in a country where consensus thinking is the norm. I mean, the thing is called the Polder model. in the Netherlands, we have it. I mean, whichever meeting I go to, there should be consensus. That's why I prefer to go to international meetings. So I'm a little bit surprised that the immediate response is, let's look for consensus. But since I'm from the Netherlands, I know how to deal with this. I think my way out, I mean, I'll also try and be a little bit sort of personal or directed to David Vines himself. I mean, I have read let's say the Vines stemming book, and I'm fairly in agreement with the way you argue about internal and external balance, but I think the core issue has to do with the definition of competitiveness. And if you reduce it to just unit labor cost, I think you are sort of misdoing it. You can actually keep all your graphs and your arguments with a much broader notion of non-price competitiveness and so on. So I'm okay. Now, what is this? What is the way out or the solution? I think there's this interesting thing, and that is something which is there in the Keynesian literature. Wages are double-faced. Wages, on the one hand, are a cost. And when we see wages as a cost, it is immediately we talk about cost competitiveness. Wages, on the other hand, are a source of income, a source of demand, which means there is this other part of wages. So yes, I mean, higher wages may have an impact. Let's say higher wages in Germany or Netherlands or in the core countries will have an impact on Eurozone imbalances, but not through the cost competitiveness channel, but through the income, that is the import demand channels. I mean, that is the way, that is also external, internal balance. So I think we have to be very clear. I'm not going to backtrack on this, on my idea that unit labor cost competitiveness, when you go to extremes, obviously, I mean, but within bands which are sort of considered normal within Eurozone context, which is actually changing. I mean, with a 30% internal devaluation in Greece, we are not. There's no norm. But let's say within more normal bands, I think changing cost competitiveness don't matter too much for competitiveness. About Greece, I mean, obviously a lot of money has gone in. I've read recent reports. I've seen people arguing based on European Commission reports that 90% of the public money or outside money which has gone into Greece actually has gone out of Greece to support core country banks. So I mean that is another take. I haven't seen the bookkeeping.
Which is wrong. Which is 1/3, as I said. I can give you the numbers.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just making. I wanted to say I'm not an expert on this, so I have no. But the point is there is this counter argument about structural reforms. I think I'm going to propose an INET project, which is sort of trying to frame Italian recovery as a function of the opening hours of pharmacies. I think that would be something which is really interesting. I do not see any. I mean, I think the more serious answer, and I will not go into details, is that macroeconomists, with all their good things, should do something, that is new economic thinking, should actually try to get in touch with people who do innovation and labor relations, industrial relations, go to the, let's say, the real, the tangible side of what these production functions or whatever, what all these things are actually telling you, also in terms of worker motivation and so on. Yeah, I think that would be the more serious answer. I think there's much to learn.
Good. I absolutely agree with you that we often use these words structural reform as a sort of overall rhetorical envelope, and actually there is surprisingly little really good analysis of what are the different categories of it and what effect are they likely to have. I think it is an area where better analysis is required. Andrea, you are going to have the last word because I'm then going to have to finish. We are already about 10 minutes over. Andrea.
Okay. Markets are not fond to fund Greece, but they are fond to fund everybody else now that yields are near zero with QE. Structural reforms are extremely important. There is another discussion. There is a wide range of reforms possible, and this is another discussion of what reforms are preferable. But they touch on the real side, the Adam Smith relevance for the real structure of the economy. The other question is the monetary impediments. And Stiglitz, by the way, he also believes that savings fund investment. The only difference is that he has income as the equilibrating variable rather than the interest rate, but that's all. And my key message was that we should start with a clarity on principles, that savings seek funding, and I wouldn't even use the word stimulus or nominal demand stimulus, because this is really the question of giving people the possibility, the monetary possibility of buying their own output. Demand matters, but must be properly financed. Yes, and this means that macro policy should be about looking at what combination of financial balances of different sectors are compatible and consistent with public policy. There are a number of possible policy actions that can follow from this principle. The difference is really political. One could argue that Europe should raise the debt GDP ceiling to 120%. This is not politically acceptable, I believe. One could suggest a 50% tax cut of all VAT in all 19 nations of the Eurozone. I'm not sure this is also politically doable. The road that seems to be the one that Europe may be going is to have a public infrastructure spending that is not in the fiscal compact, and but it all boils down to my simple T-shirt model of job creation. You need to fund the savings with some kind of debt, and so a combination of private debt, public debt, and foreign debt must be the objective of macroeconomic policy, and Europe will not be able to really go into a new path of prosperity if it does not address this particular question. Putting a cap on one of the three sources creates an unacceptably imbalanced situation and unsustainable situation of the Eurozone.
And Andrea, thank you very much for those concluding remarks. There was a forest of other people who wanted to come in. I'm afraid we just don't have time. Can I thank the panel very, very much indeed for their contributions. Foreign exchange risk unleashed a set of capital flows. Indeed, I would point out that that was a deliberate intent of the Eurozone creation. If you go back to a Commission document written in 1991 about the values which would come from European monetary union, it was a document entitled One Market, One Money, and in it you will find an explicit argument that one of the benefits of a large Eurozone is that we will get more capital flows, and that the capital will flow from the areas of high productivity to the areas of low productivity, and that they will speed the process of convergence around Europe because capital will be able, once free of foreign exchange limitations, to pursue the greatest opportunities, which it was perceived must lie in the areas which were presently furthest behind in productivity. But there's a school of thought that says, but we got lots of capital flows. We know that we got lots of capital flows because there were large current account deficits. So the flip side is capital flows. But that those capital flows turned out to be not helpful capital flows, but harmful capital flows, which created instability. Capital flows which in some cases to Greece and Italy had a large public element to them. In others were almost entirely private capital flows. So these are the different interpretations and issues of the causes of the Eurozone crisis, which we're going to discuss. They don't necessarily map easily into what are the solutions, because sometimes whatever the cause, you then have to deal with the situation which has subsequently arisen. But we have a very fine panel of people to address these issues, and we're going to go in the following order from right to left. Very briefly, Domenico Lombardi is director of CG's Global Economy Programme. CG is a partner of INET in many of our activities, and before he did that role, he was senior fellow at Brookings Institute, focusing on issues to do with the Eurozone. Professor Hans-Werner Sinn is professor at the University of Munich and president of the IFO Institute. And he should also, I should mention, is an author of a book called The Euro Trap, which I have to say is well worth reading with a particular point of view on these issues. Servas Strom is a senior lecturer at Delft University of Technology and also an author of a book on macroeconomics beyond the Nauru. And Andrea Terzi is Professor of Economics at Franklin University, Switzerland, and also attachment at the Levy Institute of Bard College, and was a co-editor about 8 years ago now, I think, of a book called The Euroland and the World Economy. So they're each going to talk for 15 minutes. I'm going to try to enforce control and discipline to 15 minutes because we believe in rules in Europe. And then I hope we'll have time for a good discussion. Domenico, can you start?
Thanks, Adair. Thanks very much for this invitation. What I'm gonna present on this morning draws from some joint work that we have been doing at CG, jointly with my CG colleague Samantha Sentamand. As you can see from the title of the first slide, we have decided to focus on Italy for a few reasons. First, because Italy was the economy, one of the economies that was worst hit by the global financial crisis in 2007, 2009. It lost about 6.6% of GDP then. Just to give you an idea, the Eurozone lost 4.4%, and the US, which was the center from which the crisis propagated, its GDP went down by 3%. So these are some order of magnitude. But that was not the end, of course, in the ensuing Eurozone sovereign debt crisis.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session, which is on the Eurozone crisis, fiscal profligacy or capital flows as final causes. I'm actually just the first thing I'm going to do is to tell the technicians the order in which we're going so that they have the slides. We're taking it in the order on the programme, okay, with Mr. Domenico Lombardi first. The issue that we're discussing this morning is the root causes of the Eurozone crisis. Obviously, once the crisis had occurred, there has been a lot of focus on the fiscal positions of some countries and the issues of debt sustainability and the debates backwards and forwards about fiscal austerity, fiscal consolidation, whether that impacts on demand in a favourable way or whether it impacts in a confidence on an alternative favourable way. We have those debates which focus on the fiscal position of different countries. But there is a school of thought that says that in the origins of the crisis, we shouldn't focus on the fiscal positions of countries because some of the countries which ended up in significant crisis and taking significant amounts of fiscal austerity medicine actually before the crisis had very low levels of public debt. That was true of Ireland and Spain. It was not true of Italy and Greece. And maybe what we're going to find in this debate is that, like many things in economics, there's an element of truth on both sides and that there are different causes of this crisis. But the alternative point of view of the causes of the crisis is that it wasn't primarily to do with fiscal profligacy in the first place, but was to do with the fact that the creation of the Eurozone with a space in which there was no
Italy's economy has contracted the second most among Eurozone member countries, next to Greece. And in fact, its GDP is still expected to remain smaller than its pre-crisis level by the year 2019. And I would say the third reason why we have decided to focus on Italy is its public debt. First of all, in proportion to GDP, it's again the second highest in the Eurozone after Greece, standing at over 135% of GDP. But also, but in absolute terms, given the sheer size of the Italian economy, is essentially the highest in the Eurozone, even higher than Germany's or France's, despite those are larger economies than Italy's. So with this as a way of background, actually, can I get a pointer, please?
Okay. The pointer.
So,
right. Could somebody bring the pointer? Maybe you can put the first slide up. Yeah, they'll set the first slide. Where is the pointer?
and so essentially, these slides a little bit capture what I've been saying so far. As you can see, the gap between Italy's GDP dynamics and the Eurozone as a whole has been widening in the outer years of the chart, and clearly, this gap is likely to persist in the coming years. So with this as a background, we asked the key question: what caused Italy's economy to fall so far, and also why its debt grew so large, especially during the crisis? One thing I want to thank you. Clearly, as it is as it is evident from the title of this session, and as Adair pointed out at the outset, two sort of main explanations have been put forward to explain the euro area crisis. One is clearly an emphasis on the fiscal position, so whether there is excessive fiscal expenditures or a fiscal position that is unsustainable. And then the other argument, and I'm a little bit, I'm summarizing here, has to do with current account imbalances and excessive borrowing following the introduction of the single currency. And so just we have decomposed the debt to GDP ratio for Italy for the latest 20 years plus. Just want to draw your attentions on two facts. First, the green bar, the green portion, which essentially gives you the size of the primary balances. As you can see, Italy has always run positive primary balances, and with a couple of exceptions, with the exception of a couple of years. And then the second fact I'd like to draw your attention on is that the real the GDP growth component has actually contributed to increase the debt to GDP ratio in the later years, essentially following the collapse in GDP growth. And this is why, as I said, the GDP component is exerting a positive, unfortunately, a positive contribution to the debt to GDP ratio. So with that in mind, if we carried some simple simulations, again, to further reiterate the point. The solid line is the actual debt to GDP trajectory, and then the large dotted line is